It might actually surprise you, given all the different views out there, how much agreement there actually is among scholars about certain, well, core facts concerning Jesus of Nazareth.
It really is quite striking. We're not talking theology here, but actual historical claims where scholars, using critical methods, have found a surprising amount of common ground.
And that's what we want to unpack in this deep dive, isn't it? This idea of the minimal facts approach.
Exactly. It's about a specific set of historical points, mainly around Jesus' death and what happened right after, that have gained really broad acceptance among critical historians.
Not because of faith commitments, necessarily, but because the evidence itself is seen as remarkably strong when you apply standard historical tests.
Right, and the sources they use are quite varied. Of course, the New Testament is key, but it's not just that. They look at other early writings, non-Christian sources, too.
The strength of this approach is that the evidence holds up across different viewpoints.
It really does.
So yeah, get ready for some potential aha moments.
Right.
Because we'll see how scholars from very different backgrounds, agnostic, even atheist historians, end up agreeing on these basic historical points.
Okay, so where do we start? Maybe with how historical Jesus research itself has shifted over time.
Good idea. Because the current landscape didn't just appear out of nowhere, right?
No, definitely not. Scholarship has gone through phases. You had periods like, Old German liberalism, which was often quite skeptical about the Gospels historically.
Okay.
Then later, things like Neo-Orthodoxy or the Bultmannian school, they often focused more on the theological message, the kerygma, sometimes, pushing the actual historical person of Jesus a bit into the background.
So the focus wasn't always on what can we historically verify.
Not always with the same intensity, perhaps, but then came what's usually called the third quest for the historical Jesus, especially in the later 20th century.
And what defined that?
A renewed effort, really, to apply rigorous historical methods, the same kind historians use for, say, Caesar Augustus, to the evidence about Jesus, especially around his death and the claims of resurrection.
So using standard historical tools.
Precisely. And that application of critical historiography is a big reason why we see more affirmative conclusions about certain core events today. It's about the methodology.
Which brings us nicely to this idea of consensus in history. What does that mean in this context? It sounds tricky.
It is a bit. I mean, absolute agreement is rare anywhere in history. But historians like Christopher Blake or Richard Evans talk about a very considerable part of history, or a wide measure of agreement that the professional community accepts.
So not unanimity, but a strong convergence among experts.
Exactly. Michael Licona puts it well. He suggests that when you see scholars from different camps, different perspectives, arriving at similar conclusions about the data, excluding, fringe ideas that can point towards a certain objectivity.
The data itself seems to be pushing them towards agreement, regardless of their starting points.
That's the idea. It suggests something robust in the evidence.
Okay, so who were some of the first scholars, maybe even surprising ones, who started outlining these core agreed-upon facts?
Well, one really interesting figure is Robert Funk. He founded the Jesus Seminar, which was known for being quite skeptical.
Right, very critical.
Yes. But even Funk, in his book Honest to Jesus, listed some assorted facts he felt even a neutral observer could probably attest to.
Coming from him, that's significant. What did he include?
He acknowledged Jesus likely was a teacher, a healer, performed exorcisms, and critically, for the end of Jesus's life, Funk said the crucifixion under Pilate in Jerusalem is something that stood up under close and repeated examination.
Wow. Okay. What about burial?
He suggested probably a common grave, which differs from some other views, but he definitely affirmed the crucifixion itself as historical.
And the resurrection claims. How did a skeptic like Funk handle those?
That's where it gets nuanced. He argued the disciples were convinced Jesus had risen and appeared to them. He interpreted these as visions.
Visions, okay. So a natural explanation in his view.
Yes, but he acknowledged these experiences, including appearances to James and Paul, were absolutely real to the disciples and became the cornerstone of their belief and the start of the church's mission.
So he saw the belief in the resurrection appearances as historically undeniable, even if he questioned the nature of the event itself.
Precisely. Then you have Geza Vermes, a very respected Jewish historian from Oxford. His approach was to build only on what he called non-controversial facts.
Starting with the most solid ground. Makes sense. What was on his list?
Similar things. Jesus as a charismatic Jewish teacher, healer, exorcist, teachings rooted in Judaism, and he also agreed on the crucifixion under Pilate as historical fact.
Did he comment on the resurrection aspect? That seems like a point where perspectives might diverge sharply.
Well, yes, and his later work, especially his book, The Resurrection, is quite fascinating. He really dug into the New Testament evidence, trying to separate history from later legend. He even called the resurrection an unparalleled phenomenon.
Unparalleled. That's strong language from a critical historian. What led him there?
He argued the historical evidence actually supported both the empty tomb and the appearance traditions. For the tomb, he pointed to the women witnesses, an unlikely invention in that society, he thought, and the early tradition.
And the appearances.
He stressed they appear in multiple early sources, highlighting Paul's list in 1 Corinthians 15 as very significant.
So Vermes found historical weight behind both pillars, the early resurrection claim.
He did. And interestingly, he looked at various naturalistic explanations, fraud, hallucinations, swoon theory, all of them, and concluded that, in his words, none of the 6 suggested theories stands up to strict scrutiny.
Wow. So while he maintained history can't prove a supernatural event like resurrection.
Exactly. He felt the alternative explanations just didn't adequately account for the historical data we have, particularly the empty tomb and the appearances.
That's a powerful conclusion from his perspective. Who else is key here? You mentioned E.P. Sanders earlier.
Yes, E.P. Sanders, hugely influential in the Third Quest. He also stressed starting with what's relatively secure is almost indisputable facts.
And what did Sanders consider almost indisputable?
His list included Jesus' baptism by John, his work as a preacher and healer gathering disciples, and, again, the crucifixion by the Romans outside Jerusalem.
And the follow-up, the resurrection experiences.
He was very clear on this. Sanders stated that the disciples' resurrection experiences were the driving force behind them proclaiming Jesus as Christ and Lord. He didn't shy away from that term.
He really emphasized the experiences themselves.
Absolutely. He said his whole study was based on unassailable data, including Jesus' work and message. Later, he reiterated facts almost beyond dispute. The arrest, interrogation, execution, the disciples fleeing, but then their experiences of seeing him after death, and also the reports of the empty tomb.
How did he characterize those seeing experiences?
Sanders was quite emphatic. He wrote that Jesus' followers, and later Paul, had resurrection experiences is, in my judgment, a fact, a historical fact.
And he ruled out alternatives.
Yes, he explicitly rejected explanations like ghosts, resuscitation, fraud, mass hysteria. He argued they believed they encountered a living, transformed person who had died, and their conviction was so strong they'd die for it.
And this led to the church.
In his view, these experiences were the direct cause of the formation of the Christian community and calling Jesus Messiah and Lord. And remember, Sanders identified as a liberal, secularized Protestant.
It's becoming a pattern. Scholars from very different backgrounds acknowledging these core experiences, even if their interpretations differ. What about Moltmann?
Jürgen Moltmann, the theologian, also listed relatively well-attested historical facts.
Who did he include?
Public crucifixion and death, the disciples scattering, the women finding the tomb empty, and the disciples claiming they saw Jesus later, particularly in Galilee. He also pointed to Paul's list in 1 Corinthians 15 as the earliest report, plus Paul's own testimony.
And his interpretation of the appearances.
Moltmann leaned towards perhaps inward visions of a supernatural light, something deeply transformative that changed them and drove their proclamation.
Okay, so again, the core sequence, death, despair, transformation, linked to encounters. But maybe let's pause on the methodology. You mentioned the No Quest and New Quest briefly.
Right, just contextually, the No Quest, influenced heavily by Moltmann, tended to avoid searching for the historical Jesus, focusing on the preached message.
Less emphasis on history.
And the New Quest, started by his students, tried to bridge that gap, but often stayed within his shadow, you could say. A key development that really pushed things forward was the refinement of textual criteria.
Ah, the criteria of historicity. Tell us about those, how they work.
They're basically tools, rules of evidence historians use. Things like, is a story or saying found in multiple independent early sources? That's multiple attestation.
Okay.
Or the criterion of dissimilarity. Is this saying or event something the early church likely wouldn't have invented because it was embarrassing or didn't fit their agenda?
Like the crucifixion itself, perhaps.
Exactly. Or the baptism of Jesus by John. Why invent your leader being baptized by someone else? And coherence, does it fit with other things we know are likely historical about Jesus?
So it's a way to sift the material critically.
Yes, and crucially, these aren't just for Bible scholars. Secular historians use similar principles all the time. Norman Perrin was an early figure really pushing these criteria to find an irreducible minimum of historical knowledge.
How did Perrin apply this to the resurrection data?
He was quite skeptical of the gospel narratives of the empty tomb and appearances, seeing them more as legend. However, he did acknowledge Paul's list in 1 Corinthians 15 and Paul's own testimony as very early and important.
So he saw some historical basis there.
He thought the appearance traditions seemed historically stronger than the empty tomb narratives, suggesting the disciples had some kind of vision that convinced them God had vindicated Jesus. But he felt Paul's testimony alone was limited.
Interesting. And Bart Ehrman, a very prominent contemporary critic, also uses these criteria extensively.
He does. And through them, he identifies certain things in Jesus' ministry as historically probable predictions about the temple, the kingdom, baptism by John, calling disciples, eating with sinners, his reputation as a healer and exorcist.
What about the end of Jesus' life, from Ehrman's perspective?
He's absolutely clear on the crucifixion. He calls it the most certain element because it's so widely attested independently, and as we said, it's not something followers would likely invent for their Messiah.
Right, the embarrassment factor. And the resurrection.
Ehrman states it's a historical fact that some of Jesus' followers came to believe he was raised soon after the execution. He explicitly names Paul and James.
He acknowledges the belief as historical fact.
Yes. And he goes further, saying he's completely certain that some disciples he points to the women insisted Jesus had appeared to them, which is what convinced them he was resurrected.
So even Ehrman, an atheist scholar, affirms the historical reality of the disciples' experiences and their resulting belief. That's quite telling about the evidence for that point.
It really is. But, it's crucial. As our source stresses, just listing facts doesn't make them history. The evidence behind each fact is what matters.
Of course.
The point of looking at all these scholars is to show this strong tendency, this convergence on the main happenings at the end of Jesus' life. These lists act like a lowest common denominator, a starting point many can agree on.
A foundation built on points where the evidence is just very hard to deny, regardless of your overall view.
Which brings us to that slightly longer list, the 12 known or accepted historical facts that get very broad agreement.
Okay, let's run through those, what's generally included.
All right. 1, Jesus died by Roman crucifixion. 2, he was buried, probably in a private tomb. 3, his disciples were initially devastated, lost hope.
Makes sense.
4, the tomb was found empty soon after. 5, the disciples had experiences they believed were appearances of the risen Jesus. 6, this teaching about the resurrection and appearances happened very early on.
Very early. Important point.
7, these experiences transformed the disciples. They became bold, willing to die for this belief. 8, this all started being proclaimed in Jerusalem. 9, the core message, the kerygma, centered on Jesus' death and resurrection.
The central message.
10, Christian communities started gathering then, often meeting on Sunday, the first day of the week. 11, James, Jesus' brother, who was skeptical before, became a leader after believing he saw the risen Jesus.
The conversion of James is often highlighted.
And 12, Paul's conversion becoming a key apostle due to a similar experience he believed was the risen Jesus.
That is a comprehensive list. And the claim is that critical scholars generally accept these as historically grounded.
Yes, there's remarkable general agreement on these specific points. And notice you don't have to assume the New Testament is generally reliable first to establish these. The evidence for each specific point stands on its own merits for many scholars.
So from that broader consensus, we get to the minimal facts, probably the absolute core.
Exactly. The minimal facts list is shorter, usually 3 to 7 points, representing the most solidly attested claims, the ones with the strongest evidence meeting criteria like multiple early independent attestation.
What are those core minimal facts then? The ones we're really focusing on.
Okay, the list usually includes these. 1, Jesus died by Roman crucifixion. 2, the disciples had experiences they believed were appearances of the risen Jesus.
The experiences again.
3, these experiences transformed them, making them willing to suffer and die. 4, this message of resurrection was proclaimed very early. 5, James, the skeptic, converted after believing he saw the risen Jesus.
James again.
6, Paul converted after a similar experience, and then there's often a +1 fact.
Which is?
The empty tomb. The evidence for the tomb being found empty shortly after burial is considered very strong by many, even if it's sometimes treated separately from the absolute core list by some minimal facts proponents.
But still widely acknowledged as having strong evidence.
Very strong, yes.
It's striking how this short list still covers the death, the powerful experiences of the disciples, James and Paul, their transformation, and the early proclamation.
It really does. And the range of scholars who accept or concede these specific points is, well, quite amazing. Agnostics, Jews, Christians, atheists. Many find the historical evidence for these particular items compelling.
And these aren't just isolated bullet points. They fit into a larger historical context.
Absolutely. They're supported by a whole network of historical considerations. They don't exist in a vacuum.
Okay, finally, you mentioned different approaches, top-down versus bottom-up. Can you quickly recap that?
Sure, the top-down approach often starts by arguing for the general reliability of, say, the Gospels, and then works down to specific facts. It's more common in conservative circles.
Starting with the text's overall trustworthiness.
Right. The bottom-up approach, which the minimal facts method aligns with more closely, starts with individual facts that have strong, specific evidence behind them, using historical criteria, and builds the case upward from there.
Like the analogy you mentioned.
Yes, the source uses the analogy of building a brick wall versus a wooden fence. The brick wall, bottom-up, focuses on laying one solidly evidenced brick at a time, aiming for a very strong, defensible foundation, even if it's initially smaller.
A foundation built on the most secure points.
Exactly. So this deep dive has really been about exploring the strength of that foundation, those minimal facts that garner such broad agreement.
And the main takeaway seems to be this really quite surprising level of consensus among diverse critical scholars on these core historical events surrounding Jesus' death and what followed immediately after.
Precisely. That minimal facts list death by crucifixion, the disciples' experiences in transformation, the conversions of James and Paul, the early proclamation, and the strong evidence for the empty tomb provides a fascinating and historically robust starting point.
So the question we leave you, the listener, with is this. Given this scholarly agreement on these core historical happenings, what's the best explanation for them? What further questions does this raise for you about Christian origins?
And if you want to dig into the evidence yourself, definitely check out the works of scholars like Funk, Vermes, Sanders, Ehrman, Moltmann, and others who engage with this data.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Maybe next time we could even dive deeper into the specific evidence for each of those minimal facts.